Thank you. It's lovely to be here and already for me enjoyable and somewhat comforting to be surrounded by English accents, if I might say. Thank you, John, for the invitation and for your kind words of introduction. Please let me greet especially Ian Wallace, with whom I worked for a time in those years in Durham. Now quite a while ago, but I spotted you, Ian, among the faces on the screen and very glad to see you. And thanks to Kat rather, for her work with the IT and Robin and her colleagues for the worship we just entered together. And I'm glad to be here today and was given the title, What is Liturgy? What makes liturgy? The key elements. And I was asked to refer along the way to the digital environment. I don't want to presume that all of my perspectives from my place will find traction in your place. Your places themselves being different. And greetings also to the person in Vancouver Island from where my grandmother came. And you'll note that as I proceed now, I make some deliberate oscillations between more and less positive takes on liturgy in the digital environment, because I think we're still working this out. I'm sure we are. And it doesn't seem to me to be too wise to have formed very firm opinions about very much of this already. So first, a little about my own context at the moment. Melbourne is the most locked down city in the world. We've just overtaken Buenos Aires. We're still living with state home orders, nightly curfews, and strict travel limits. There are only a very limited number of reasons to be out of the house. The Delta strain of the coronavirus has eventually proved unmanageable, and the elimination strategy, so-called, that was at play has now yielded. Who's to say what the comparatively low death rate and hospitalization rate that Australia has enjoyed will look like here on in? Vaccination rollout has been chaotic, to put it mildly, and there have been very long waits for doses to be imported. There's been a disgraceful lag of availability of vaccine for healthcare and other frontline workers, let alone anybody else. And many challenges remain as to lifting the numbers to a supposedly safe percentage for society to supposedly reopen in some sort of new normal, so-called. Protests, which have sometimes been violent and riotous, have been recurrent on streets very near me here, where I live at the University of Melbourne. Like schools, universities, and many businesses, churches have been shut for months. In the theological college where I work, which is a uniting church in Australia foundation and ecumenical in ethos, candidates for ministry now into the second year of their formation. The academic year is different from the UK, so we're coming to the end of year 2 in a month. They have now not shared communion together, nor indeed even sang together in the same room in that whole 2 years. So both central and simple practices of Christian worship have been absent. At the only large in-person gathering for church at which I've been present in the last 2 years, an ordination in a reprieve between lockdowns, I've also been to a few smaller events, people were served communion in plastic thimbles, each one wrapped in its own plastic case with another plastic encased host wrapped on top of the plastic glass. It will give you a clue as I begin as to where I'm coming from, that I didn't partake. And the split-second decision not to bother was an important insight for me that what I might be missing about gathered worship isn't the thing of the sacrament. The current situation I've started to describe may be recognisable in the UK, at least as a reminder of how things used to be before so-called Freedom Day. But let me ask at the beginning of my reflections, whose freedom? I suppose it must be as true in the UK as it is here in Australia that the burden of coronavirus has been borne appallingly disproportionately by the poor, the disabled, and the vulnerable. The folks who are innocuously described in the kind of daily updates on infection numbers that we still get here as having underlying health conditions. Surely concern for such persons and about such matters must be central to whatever we find to say about worship. Think of Urban Holmes's bon mot that to love God is to relieve the burden of those who suffer. The rest is tactics. Or indeed, now might be a good time to ask, after Tissa Ballysurya, why is it that in spite of hundreds of thousands of Eucharistic celebrations, Christians continue as selfish as before? While in lockdown, working from home, many of the practices of my theological college have fallen away, as I've already begun to indicate. Not only communion and communal singing, but much field work. One of the very few students with whom I work who has been able to continue in field work was working as a chaplain in an aged care facility, and she's spoken often of her pastoral visits. They, the residents of the facility, would be alone in their room while they met with her as chaplain or chaplain in training, as she stood outside on the other side of their window. She'd stand outside on the grass and talk to them through the glass. Such has been even some of the most personal pastoral care of the pandemic. But while much field work has fallen away, at the seminary some sort of worship has continued. It's been online. And with at least a regular service of the word, comprised mainly of reading, a preaching of kinds, and open prayer. We've also met online for other things, with one of the practices we've explored together being Lectio Divina, technically not liturgy, but devotion. Several weeks ago, around the Sundays of August 28 and September 3, a reading from the Song of Songs spoke of the beloved one, gazing in at the windows, looking through the lattice. That's the Song of Songs 2:9. In at least some Christian readings since Oregon, the song has been understood as Christological allegory. For me at least, the fusing of the ministry candidate's pastoral encounters through the glass from the gardens of a residential home and Song 2's image of looking in through the window has been a powerful picture of the Christa, perhaps opening up my own most affecting experience of prayer during lockdown, and something I've carried with me through this time. Even as much worship in online or very occasional gathered mode, those plastic wrapped communion elements, has not appealed to me at all. To move then to some key points about liturgy. And let me start with basic meanings, because as is well known, The word liturgy conflates some Greek words: laos, people; litos, concerning the people; and ergon, work. Hence it can be rendered work of the people or work for the people. The latter meaning, work for the people, is ancient. It seems that earliest Christianities understood liturgy as some sort of public service, something done for the common good, an action undertaken for the sake of the polis, the city-state. Think again here about the question, whose freedom, and what might have been wrong with the old normal. Then to shift to the former meaning, work of the people, liturgy is done not only on behalf of people, but by the people. And in turn, this leads to the pervasive contemporary stress in liturgical renewal on participation. This stress was very apparent in the reforms of the Second Vatican Council, which we do well to remember may have been the most important thing to affect Protestant churches in the 20th century, or so the claim is sometimes made. So although a Roman Catholic source, what might be termed an ecumenical treasure. As is also well known, Vatican II's document on the sacred liturgy speaks of full, conscious and active participation by all the people as the aim to be considered above all else. This translates into Protestant traditions as, for example, the insistence that the congregation is not an audience, which are some of the opening words of the Methodist Worship Book in the UK, and the Uniting Church hears uniting in worship. This idea that the congregation is not an audience is being echoed when James White, a liturgical theologian, speaks of people as the primary ingredient of liturgy, of people as the primary liturgical document. White's words are at the very least a reminder that if we refer to books or texts for prayer as liturgy, we're using a kind of shorthand, because liturgy is an event. It's an event with a shape in which words are breathed out of bodies in ceremonial scenes engaging the senses, speaking and listening and seeing, yes, but also touching and tasting, and doing these things together with the assembly, the celebrant of the event. As a Catholic commentator on the liturgy document of Vatican II has rightly and pithily put it, no participation, no liturgy. This person, Gabe Hook, goes on. It's the nature of the liturgy to be done by people. It's not done to people. It's not done in the presence of people. People do it, and the plural is correct, because it's as a church assembled that people do liturgy. The same author, Gabe Hook, also speaks smartly about liturgy in terms of verbs. He says, gather, greet, reflect, confess, seek mercy, pray, read and listen, observe silence, chant, acclaim, preach, intercede, share, praise, thank, lament, embrace, break bread, process, eat, drink, sing, bless, take leave. But note that watch is not on his list. All of this helps to underline that liturgy resists spectatorship. It opposes passivity. It seems plainly obvious to me that these emphases, public service for the common good and the people's participation, liturgy of and for the people, were not always very evident in a lot of churches before the current digital turn in the COVID pandemic. Far too many churches were insular, inward turned, adrift in what they had to contribute to their wider communities. And far too many had lost grasp on the idea that the congregation is the celebrant, because deadened by ritual lines that render the majority of persons lumpen on the sidelines. Far too much liturgy was clericalized in grim ways, and there are Protestant as well as Catholic possibilities as to how this might happen, none of them good. We might not appreciate Eric Maskell's air of Anglican superiority in a book he published a few years before Vatican II, The Recovery of Unity, but we can still learn from that book his even-handed castigation of clericalism in different modes. For example, when he says in Catholic circles, it's as if the sole executant of the Mass is the priest, or its Protestant variant, when the minister performs the liturgy with intolerable verbosity, praying, reading, exhorting, and preaching, while, quote, the laity are hardly allowed to say a word from start to finish. As Maskell sees it, all of this is part of the medieval legacy. And Gordon Lathrop's revival of Monique's notion of anti-liturgica is essential reading for learning to spot what Lathrop calls the hierarchical distortion and the closed circle distortion of liturgy gone wrong. Note that these distortions mess up the participation of all the people when they tilt into hierarchy, and public service when they morph into a closed circle. To cite some of Lathrop's cautions, read the distortion of hierarchy, watch out for a grand chair for the presider, an entrance procession like the arrival of a monarch, servers fussing on around the leader, pulpits way above people's heads, places accessible only to the clergy, the presider standing while others kneel, bishops in phallic hats. And on goes the dismal list that Lathrop makes about hierarchy, anti-liturgica. And read the closed circle, lines around our group, fencing the table, heavy teaching about boundaries, lots of rules, creating an in-crowd, withdrawal from the wider context, all of which are means of closing the door. That the digital environment might alleviate many of the problems of clericalism doesn't seem at all self-evident to me, given that from the get-go, the digital environment is vulnerable to the closed circle. For starters, who controls and distributes the Zoom link? And so far as I can see, at almost every turn, it's susceptible to hierarchy. How easily in Zoom, I observe, gallery view gives way to speaker view when the clergy turn up. So I want to suggest that digital worship might need not just care, but suspicion about both clerical takeover and further retreat from the public realm. However, perhaps at least some of what I've said so far might be put more positively, or at least the present time might be one of opportunity for learning more fiercely to contest what was already wrong about a lot of liturgy. For example, when Brian Cones suggests that Zoom is an improvement on the banks of forward-facing pews in our church building, instead of the back of so many heads, we see a sea of faces, which casts in digital relief the idea that the church is simply people joined in common prayer and purpose. Although I'm not sure that I have seen which Zoom in practice level the assembly, I hope that it might be possible to learn ways of using it that do. And as Zoom makes near impossible, and certainly often turns very ugly when unison prayer is attempted, texts proposed to be spoken by all, words put into other people's mouths, perhaps lots of that will die, which I think would be a good thing. If we hold on to the prayer of Jesus and keep some prayers we have in common, and keep our bold text brief. We had some nice examples of how to do it well in worship earlier, I think. There's an awful lot left that might otherwise be foist on us that I certainly would be pleased never come back to in-person worship. And I also do see some other opportunities. I've mentioned one already in my appreciative comments about Lectio Divina over Zoom, as well as open prayer. In my theological college, around open prayer at least, we used Gail Ramshaw's template for the prayers of intercession to help people find their voices in the prayers of the people. And I strongly commend Gail Ramshaw's resources to you. And alongside Lectio Divina, I think that a kind of Visio Divina is something that Zoom might well facilitate. A collective attention to art and to pictures that might be analogous to practices of reading. Of course, these aren't practices that we needed to wait for a pandemic to begin to explore. And I think at least of a set of images that Christian Aid distributed around the millennium, and this in a CD box. And I remember that in the parish where I served in the north of England, we used to amplify those and project them onto a screen and use them as the beginning of the sermon each week for a while. Perhaps a great, albeit a somewhat disturbing revelation in the time of pandemic has been how slim or thin or slight or fragile the communal spirituality of so many assemblies seems to have been. It does seem to me that the felt need some have for digital communion must be about a liturgical spirituality shrunken down such that there was nothing much else than Eucharist going on. So Eucharist is what is hankered for now online. We might of course recall and admire that the liturgy document of Vatican II talks of Eucharist as source and summit of liturgy. But it's another thing when it becomes hook, line, and sinker, when it's become not just central, but smothering of a wider liturgical repertoire. The principal service, in effect, the only one. And perhaps current conditions have shown up starkly some of the shadow side of the parish communion movement. While we might be skeptical about the sometimes claimed revival of evensong all over the country, depending on who you listen to, we might agree that the revival of choral evensong, we might agree that liturgical spirituality is larger than communion. So perhaps current reasons for exploring the digital possibilities of liturgy suggest it would be good to recover more than may have been lost in the pandemic if what people are missing is Eucharist. How many Anglican churches, for example, have searched for and found ways to celebrate locally common worship's encouragement of rediscovery of the catechumenate, baptismal remembrance, prayer for healing, lament, testimony, daily prayer, and so much else, all of which is richly provided for in common worship. As I see it, the greatest opportunity of the present time is to encourage some new exploration of liturgical spirituality. And so in the time left, just two things on that. First, Anglican tradition is not the only branch of the Church to have in recent years proliferated resources for daily prayer. To cite just some of the most creative among a very diverse range, the daily services and daily devotions of a New Zealand prayer book, prayer during the day, as well as the fulsome offices of common worship daily prayer, the adaptation of monastic cycles and for the secular prayer in the US-based Episcopal Church's daily prayer for all seasons. And we could easily add excellent examples from ecumenical counterparts. I particularly like the Presbyterian Church USA's Book of Common Worship's daily prayer with its strong daily recollection of baptism. Perhaps there's no time like the present for both personal and communal exploration of such things, in either the absence of gathering or the restricted gathering of current experience wherever we are. And finally, Eucharist has always been a service of word and table, as Methodist tradition has tended recently to call the Eucharist. And Vatican II has talk of two tables, the table of the Word and the Eucharistic altar. Gordon Lathrop reminds of Jerome's ancient conviction that we eat the flesh and drink the blood of the divine Saviour in the Holy Eucharist, but so do we in the reading of the Scriptures. And Lathrop also draws forward a focus on Luther's encouragement, Luther having said that when you open the book containing the Gospels and read or hear how Christ comes, here or there, or how someone is brought to him, you should therein perceive the sermon or the Gospel through which he is coming to you. When you see how he works, how he helps everyone to whom he comes, then rest assured that faith is accomplishing this in you. He is offering your soul exactly the same sort of help and favour, Luther said. I wonder if these ideas figured strongly, would there be a push or a rush for online communion? I wonder how might a fuller engagement with the Word come forward at this time. And given the company, radical Christians who might perceive their relation to Scripture or to sacrament more critically than they can relate to easily in those echoes of Jerome or Luther, might ponder the possibility of, for example, learning how to take up some feminist liturgical practice of, to echo Letty Russell, talking back to the tradition around their communal reading of Scripture, or post-colonial strategies of contrapuntal reading, interrupting the readings with counter-narratives as they think about what use of the Bible might be like both in communal gatherings online and or in person. Again, there's absolutely nothing here that we needed to wait for a pandemic or for an online platform to start to explore. But these two examples, daily prayer and Bible reading are just starting reminders that there's much more than Eucharist to sacramental and liturgical spirituality. Perhaps the current pandemic and/or the digital environment might help us to make a larger liturgical spirituality our own. However impeded we may have been by hierarchies, by closed circles, by lurking clericalisms, by the unwitting narrowness of parish communion, which were all so deleterious long before the advent of COVID-19. And what it might now be possible to discover or recover, we will do well not to lose as some sort of new normal appears. Thanks for listening.